What if I told you there existed a virtual world without NPCs, or copious amounts of monsters randomly roaming the world to slaughter, just inhabited by its player base, capable of playing as the game's government, police forces, and even more? Face of Mankind, developed by a German studio Duplex Systems and published by Ojum, Face of Mankind would launch back in March of 2006. However, despite cultivating a cult audience and surprising players with the amount of sandbox mechanics in the game, Face of Mankind would be shut down just 1 year later, and then brought back again a few years later, with some improvements. This iteration of FOM, as it's often called, would last the longest and eventually be shut down much later in 2015. But there's more to the story of Face of Mankind than just its 2 lives and shutdowns. We have a story of a failed Kickstarter/scam even, a failed remake, and a rogue server that recently sprouted out from kind of nowhere. While many of you might not know what Face of Mankind is or was, my objective is to remedy that by the end of this episode of Death of a Game, a series where we diagnose the largest contributing factors to a game or company's death or eventual death through the use of a timeline of events, collecting clues and evidence along the way. This finally culminates in every detective's favorite moment, the final deduction, where we crack the case for good. With Face of Mankind's official servers shut down and the sequel cancelled, it's a perfect time as any to find itself on the Death of a Game series. Choose one of the 10 factions, whether you join the world's police force, the LED, or the military, the FDC, and let's get to the case in yet another virtual world. The story begins quite far back, early 2000s, the time right before World of Warcraft and right after the insane impact of Phantasy Star Online, EverQuest 1, and Ultima Online in the late 90s. Globally, everyone was learning what a virtual world was.
Man, this place looks expensive. I feel like I'm wasting a fortune just standing here.
And what it was capable of producing for its players. A world with endless possibilities, featuring different unique threats and characters depending on the setting or IP, and a third place for people to congregate and create new relationships at. Something desperately needed in today's society. At this time, the world, or our world, was rife with new virtual worlds popping up left and right, of all shapes and sizes. It was sort of a golden age for online RPG gamers, really. The sheer amount of variety that existed on the market made the market even more exciting due to so much choice and competition, and not all games being designed the same. Cough cough.
Whoa, slow down, egghead.
Face of Mankind would actually have its development started sometime in late 2001 or early 2002. And little was known about Face of Mankind initially, besides the fact that it was being talked about as a sci-fi MMORPG and could potentially feature unique combat. Face of Mankind would enter its closed beta quietly in April of 2004, and at this time we can see the first trailer released for the game. In many ways, the gameplay you can see, even for the time, looks like a true sci-fi virtual world experience with plenty of zones and biomes to navigate, seemingly populated by the players themselves. For me, this trailer is kick-ass. First off, I've been bragging about how good virtual world trailers and MMORPG or MMORPG trailers used to be when the devs actually played the games and knew what we liked, and this is a good example. Look at the sense of scale that's communicated with this trailer, the sci-fi elements, and for the time, the impressive visuals. The trailer also showcases what you can do in the game. Wow, novel concept, like roleplay, character customization, and even combat, and much more. Literally everything in the game is pretty much in the trailer, without some over-the-top fake gameplay or trailer glossed over it. Now, having cool CGI hype stuff is important, but also having brass tack stuff like this is probably more important. Face of Mankind was looking like a serious sci-fi MMO, which was a rare breed, I should add, with the 3 other most successful ones at the time being Anarchy Online, Star Wars Galaxies, and EVE Online. The reason for this rarity, though, is a bit simple, though kind of lame. And that's because sci-fi worlds bring with them far more expectations, partly due to our exposure with good sci-fi, but also due to the advancements in our technology. We don't want to just go zone to zone, we want to go planet to planet, and galaxy to galaxy. The expectations, even if you control the setting or environment, are almost always going to be higher with a sci-fi world than a fantasy one, simply due to the sheer possibilities of gameplay alone. It was a bit worrying, though, that FOM was being backed by basically an unknown publisher, or at least a very small one who only really worked with smaller games or mobile games. Ojum would later become a subsidiary of Jamba, but I have no idea what happened to them after that, as they seem to have gone cold as of late. Duplex Systems, on the other hand, was a team built just for Face of Mankind, so they lacked the experience and proper funding that was probably needed as well. These would both serve as major barriers to the game being successful, especially when surviving the dreaded first month within a virtual world was so difficult. And well, both companies and, well, most MMO developers and publishers were pretty much never prepared for what came after launch. Face of Mankind, as typical with virtual worlds back in the day, sigh, I miss those times, would have a lengthy and actionable open beta starting from 2005 and leading all the way into the game's launch. FOM was like a playground for sci-fi nerds who wanted to see what it was like to live, roleplay, and fight in another world. You can see that in the various footage from the open beta, which ran rather successfully for Face of Mankind. FOM allowed you as a player to basically be whatever you wanted to be, right from the jump. This freedom attracted all kinds of players, but it would also potentially attract players who could ruin the experience for others, as always with virtual worlds. In most virtual worlds, developers would utilize things like NPCs and game mechanics to try to, balance these things. But Face of Mankind was going for more of a novel approach. They wanted to put the tools in the player's hands, not have things like NPCs or safeguards built into the game foundationally. Having a police force and military force, staffed by the players themselves, was supposed to be able to fully combat this, but the truth is, spoiler, it doesn't. And we already knew that, because Ultima Online came out in the 90s and Trammel already happened. And sure, those were NPCs, but you have to know that if you leave players to their own devices, good intentions or not, they always end up creating a world that's dangerous and lawless. That's why virtual world pioneers like Richard Bartle state that world builders must act like a DM or a god of their own world, because players will always follow the same patterns, relying on the easiest solutions, and some surviving environments that aren't really even hospitable to others, kind of giving you a false sense of an audience or success. If you don't police your community though, through the game mechanics or storytelling/rules, they will police themselves, and we have never really seen that actually come out like totally good, like ever. That's because in a virtual world you can't actually die for real, so the downside for committing crime is much, much lower. This makes zero-sum gameplay, aka murk a noob real quick and just steal his loot, which was possible in Face of Mankind, or other less fair manners of killing them, quite popular. And that kind of gameplay isn't sustainable. When one player spends hundreds of hours and another takes that in just 10 minutes, you have an issue where, because things like insurance systems don't exist, proper laws and bounty hunting systems, and an actual economy outside of the players, this means that the game only really rewards one style of gameplay, which is the kind of gameplay that pushes just about all other players away. Wolves eating everything until only the wolves are left. But perhaps over time these systems could be expanded, and Face of Mankind could actually properly reflect a virtual world that made sense in more modern times, but more on that later. Face of Mankind would launch about 4 years into its development, March 27th, 2006, and on PC only. And as the blurb about the game states, Face of Mankind is set in the 21st century in a persistent universe. The human colonies have been established in space, but the alien species have started to threaten their safety. Players have to assume the role of a character either on Earth or in a remote space colony, and they will then be able to choose between different character types, including like soldiers, law enforcers, rebels, and even more. They can join one of the 10 large organizations in the game, including military, corporate, and rebel different types of groups. Including military, corporate, and rebel groups. The game would also feature elements of roleplay, action, and economic strategy, and was being built on Lithtech's Talon 3D engine. Oh, speaking of which, the Lithtech engine bit at the end is actually really interesting, because it's an engine that was created largely by Monolith Productions, rip in peace. But it would go on to be used for the Middle-earth series much later on, and it is quite the impressive engine. Even The Matrix Online, another sci-fi MMO, would use it, launching the same year as Face of Mankind, by the way, which probably didn't help FOM's reception, with MXO, as it's called, being far more popular, and being launched by SOE, Sony Online Entertainment, themselves. FOM had nearly no major media coverage, and part of me wonders if this was due to the inability of Ojum, the publisher, to properly market the game, mixed with MXO probably gobbling up all of the marketing for sci-fi games or rivaling it in a way that you probably couldn't compete, or that the studio behind the game, a German one, was likely not as easy to market with compared to a US or Korean one. This would hurt the game because it had a rather small population initially. The reason this is so crucial, to reiterate, is that the game was only built on player interaction, meaning that if there's not enough players, the game really wouldn't function properly. But lead designer and leader Marco Diekman of Duplex Systems would express that the game was going to be moving towards improvement with the Milestone 2 patch, and would detail more about the game's general mechanics going forward. The problem is, with Milestone 2, FOM would already change tremendously, with many of the faction systems not working the same way anymore, and other mechanics also being changed. Worse, it introduced far more bugs than it actually fixed, even if the system changes were kind of good, making the already questionable combat, which was actually an action-style combat more so than a tap-target one, largely about shooting your opponent the most first. So yeah, Face of Mankind was actually more like an MMO ARPG than an MMORPG featuring action combat. The issue being bad hit detection, clunky combat, and now an increased amount of bugs added with the new changes, and the combat was made even worse than it already was before. The only time you even fought in Face of Mankind on top of things was due to player conflict, which kind of sounds cool in theory, right? Like no leveling, no traversing the world killing random farm animals. But then you realize that this concept only exists because they removed or neutered all of the threats that could be present in an environment or world. So now the players themselves would pose the only one. This would not make them more cooperative, but instead do the opposite, making them also more inclusive as players. Following the major changes, or perhaps some nerd getting smacked around online in a video game, you know, a tragedy, massive DDoS attacks would pop up May 2007. And what started as just normal server ping DDoS attacks would become more sophisticated with bot networks aiding in the attacks. DDoS attacks can't really be stopped, but they can be mitigated, whether through multi-tiered systems, proper monitoring, and more. But these DDoS attacks were proving expensive to Ojum and the devs supporting the game because of loss of revenue, reputation damage, and the need of a cost mitigation. And really, a server in a virtual world, anytime it goes down, it's a travesty for nerds around the world. That's because this world serves as another world or home for many players like myself.
No way. I'm getting hacked.
It would take sadly a year for FOM to rid themselves of these DDoS attacks in full, tracking the actual perpetrator behind the attacks to a computer science student in London. You know, the classic loser evil virgin nerd origin story. This 16-year-old wasn't named due to legal reasons, but I'll name that they probably got shit on in-game and wanted to enact their revenge on everyone. Real loser shit. But that loser shit was enough to create a cascading sequence of events where others also would start DDoSing the server, realizing it was vulnerable, forcing the publisher, Ojum, who was ill-equipped to deal with this, to cease support for the development and operation of Face of Mankind just a year and some change after the game just came out. Network admins and cybersecurity techs existed, even for the time, but perhaps Ojum just didn't see the juice worth the squeeze, and this was their way out, or just weren't sure how to proceed. And just like that, in a jiffy, a year later, and Face of Mankind, a highly unique sci-fi MMORPG, was already shut down. But Duplex wouldn't give up, however. Although they lost their publisher, they would promise within just 1 week that they had intentions to rework and relaunch Face of Mankind. The new relaunch was being dubbed Face of Mankind Rebirth and was set to be a remake and not just a relaunch of Face of Mankind. However, within the summer of the following year, this project would be announced to be cancelled. And my guess is that Duplex Systems couldn't get a publisher for it, and since they were just a small company, they couldn't self-publish. But although the Rebirth project was cancelled, within the same year, in December, faceofmankind.com would pop up and have the announcement coinciding, stating that FOM would be relaunched as a game, and the game would now be co-developed by Duplex Systems and a new company, Nexion Technologies. Now, I don't have a lot of information on Nexion, other than the fact that they were reportedly a small dev team made up of former players. Later on, it will be divulged that Nexion's partnership was largely about them handling the server-related tasks, while Duplex would focus on development. The new duo team was quick to strike, though, and would host a closed beta February 20th, 2009. And later the same year, December 29th, 2009, and Face of Mankind would re-release, this time introducing both free and premium accounts. The freemium standard most virtual world gamers are kind of familiar with, where subscribing would get you better benefits and quality of life changes. The premium would cost just $9, which was rather fair for the time. The problem being is that this business model was relying on them being able to consistently convince their player base, month after month, with content, that they're worth the money. That's because the game didn't really have a cash shop, so it had to make money from freemium conversions. But the issue being, your game isn't built for this. You designed an open world sandbox almost as close to like a survival game later on would become, that's reliant on players to do all of the heavy lifting. This means you have nothing to keep feeding players month after month, story-wise or gameplay-wise past a point. That's why survival games cost a box price. MMORPGs with sub-fees work because they consistently introduce new content and mechanics. Being a sandbox, though, that prides itself on the players doing all of that for you makes that a bit of a confusing proposition. Unless you can really just do everything in the game, right? But that was a bit of a misnomer with Face of Mankind. Sure, the player could do a lot of things and had a lot of freedom, and items all in the game were created by players, but they didn't actually fill the blanks in the rest of the world. What about the variety of roles and tasks within a faction? What about non-combat focused things besides just mining? That was kind of like the only non-combat thing you could do in the game, besides being a politician, which was kind of like just playing the game socially. Meanwhile, games like Vanguard Online, a Brad McQuaid game, actually had a fully fleshed out diplomacy system that was kind of like a card game. But if Face of Mankind was just a sandbox for factional warfare, it's not the same as being a virtual world sandbox. At that point, it was closer to being more of like an open-ended, less combat-focused version of PlanetSide. Problem being is that PlanetSide, another sci-fi virtual world, boasted far better and more ambitious combat and gameplay that fulfills your factional desire for control pretty well. While Face of Mankind over time could have made the changes necessary to make their game more friendly to newcomers and more content besides just fighting in the game, they took a strange turn, seemingly largely on Marco's focus, to be a player-centric virtual world instead. That's because Face of Mankind actually initially had a GM team, or kind of like a DM team if you will, a team of in-game devs who would fulfill factional roles to kind of make sure things would move smoothly, or didn't. It ended up being abandoned, however, in favor of more of an open-ended player-focused style of play. My guess is that they polled the player base, and when you pull a niche player base who plays such a game, they always respond with, well, we don't want that. Well, why would they want mechanics in the game that could potentially make them worse? That's why sometimes as a developer, you have to go against the players. Now the population was just continuing to shrink, and the only players remaining, the most elite of them, were just remaining. So when new players would try to join the game, they would find a largely unhelpful world built around a faction system where players would encounter you, toss you a set of gear, and then tell you to get in vent or call you a noob. And yeah, even GameSpot wrote about this in their impressions. Or perhaps they just murdered you for whatever loot you had on you. And with less players, suddenly the law enforcement department didn't have enough legs to stop criminals and arrest them. And then, because there aren't any safeguards built into the world, you know that players could and would ruin if given the chance, the world just stops functioning properly. The idea of a libertarian virtual world sounds cool, but it's never really been proven to work yet. And yet all the same has trapped many talented designers, people, and gamers all the same. When I spoke to Raph Koster, the designer behind Ultima Online who encountered this lesson firsthand, Raph made it a point to tell me that even though he designed the game being kind of like Face of Mankind initially, that he was wrong in that design, and that you must actually police your world and introduce a functional system that checks and balances things out, not just because you can, but because you know what bad is capable of in these worlds. Not doing such is almost like irresponsible, as he would state. Well, that was a lot of theory. We don't normally go that deep into theory on the series. I mean, I usually charge people for that stuff. But now Face of Mankind was under new management, aka Nexion. They had fully taken over, and Marco and the crew had largely moved on. Marco would come back shortly in 2012 to work with them, but then would end up working on other games largely, and still is involved heavily in video game development today. Though he would seemingly never attempt another player online-driven sandbox world again, and I don't blame him. Nexion seemed like guys you would celebrate. They were bringing in new features, bug fixes, and were passionate about Face of Mankind because they were players themselves. Some of these changes were major too, like a tutorial system that was like 5 years too late, and some new famous maps that were being integrated, like New York. Nexion would also add an item shop to the game, aka a cash shop, as well as promise more ambitious features later on, like additional colonies, customizable housing in the form of the apartment system, and more. Now, the item shop might have gotten some collective groans from everyone watching now, but this was a humble virtual world who needed to make money, and their previous business model just wasn't really working. It was a free game after all, and they couldn't switch to buy to play because the player base that was already playing the game was already playing the game. You can't just sell the game to them again. FOM would come out swinging though. In 2012, forgotten about by most or not, and release a slew of new features including more support for politician gameplay, public apartments, and the removal of restrictions on gear sets for all factions. Each faction in the game would offer you unique benefits and buffs, and debuffs sometimes, depending on which one you would choose. Whether you just joined the Guardians of Mankind, tasked with being a peaceful faction, or the Brotherhood of Shadows, a criminal faction, each of these were kind of given different benefits for why they would succeed at certain tasks. Like the military in the game spawned way faster, so they're pretty hard to fight against, you get the idea? But the removal of the gear set restrictions for me at this point was an example of how the roleplay in Face of Mankind had kind of deteriorated for a while, because of the lack of world, really. And well, roleplay coming from the game itself, not just the players. For me, it defeats the purpose of the factional armor if someone else can just wear it. But I wouldn't care about that if nobody else was really playing my game, I guess. Now that might sound harsh, but even with the good changes, Face of Mankind was hurt by 2012. They were really hurt. They were on the verge of being knocked out. I mean, PlanetSide 1 was already beating it up before, and now a sequel to that looked way sexier and far more ambitious just launched and was looking like a whole 5 generations ahead of Face of Mankind. Worse, with the rise of the survival game genre, largely coming from the lack of servicing for these players in the virtual world industry, I should add, this would also hurt Face of Mankind, because now with survival games, they had similar concepts, but they were better versions of the same idea, preferring to keep gameplay in the player's hands as well, while offering, well, much more graphics and gameplay and things to do in the game, like building an empire. You can see so much of the DNA of the game like Face of Mankind in these games, like Rust for example. This is where the concept of endlessly developing your aging virtual world becomes kind of delusional past a point, if you're not designing your game or company to set up for a sequel, because no matter what, people are going to move on from the game, no matter how expanded it gets, because the rest of the market continues to expand as well. Nexion seemed to notice this and would express interest in creating a sequel to Face of Mankind. This sequel, dubbed Fall of the Dominion, was set just to be that. As explained in the pitch video on Kickstarter, while the ones that weren't brought down, the new FOM was about improving the existing mechanics and features and going a step further with them even. Nexion and Marco would admit to meeting for the first time in person in 2011. They, being the CEO and Christopher Alford, credited now as the lead designer, would state that they were unaware of the issues that they were sort of encountering after they refurbished the combat. They were surprised that things really weren't working yet. Chris then would state that he knows all of the issues, or at least knew of them, just had to act on them, which is kind of a strange statement, but me being charitable, I think that they meant that they had to actually flesh out the game's systems now, but they didn't actually give any examples. And it's kind of funny that the moment of triumph is them showing a scribbly piece of paper with some hastily non-sequential ideas just written on them. I mean, you can even just read them on screen. For reference, some of us nerds, like me, in that same time can write an entire GDD on a virtual world. Meanwhile, this guy Chris just scribed some notes. But anyway, with Fall of Dominion, it turns out, I might be kidding, but it's not really that funny.
Here we go. Nothing funny.
After a year of its Kickstarter, Face of Mankind Fall of Dominion would launch a nearly entirely different game, and although there's not that much details about FOM Fall of the Dominion, what we do know is that it wasn't liked by many, including even its core audience, and from the footage appears even more glitchy looking in combat than Face of Mankind 1, and doesn't look that different. It seems less than 1 year after its launch, and the Fall of the Dominion would be shut down and no updates provided to the Kickstarter. This would be compared to them disappearing off the face of the earth with the $60,000 in tow.
So thanks. Thanks for nothing.
You're welcome.
Nexion wouldn't just kill their Kickstarter project either, and then, disappear into the sunset or whatever with other people's money, which really hurts the industry, by the way. They would also shut down the rest of the Face of Mankind servers August 31st, 2015, the previous month. And it really sucks to see the legacy of Face of Mankind tainted so much, and I'm sure Marco wasn't happy about that either. Much like many fans of FOM weren't, obviously. Nexion, I think, had a big hand in that. Sure, they helped get the game back up again, but they never really were a development team, yet wanted to be able to function like one, with Marco out of the picture at that point especially. Nexion was staffed by former hackers and longtime FOM players. Reportedly, most of their development experience was learned on the job. Basically, you had this passionate team with questionable skill and resources attempting to keep a unique virtual world alive that had a lot of problems the first time it launched. Admirable, but FOM never really did get a fair shake, did it? Marco himself would also seem to want to move on from FOM, distancing himself and only electing to work with people in advisory senses regarding the game, and would end up working on other games like Cloudpunk, though similarities can be seen with his new game. The community behind FOM was screwed the most. They just wanted the ability to play their favorite game again. But luckily, they would get access to a heavily encrypted build of the game around this time, which would help in their upcoming revival efforts. But once again, just like when we feel like the end is near, and everyone, just about everything has failed our beloved virtual worlds, the community behind them pops up and kind of shows out and saves the day. In this case with a trailer for what was being dubbed as Mankind Reborn. Mankind Reborn was a fan project utilizing UE5 and a team of passionate fans. Most of the footage released up until March of 2024 for the project, however, has seemingly only been about the game's environment, with little gameplay or actual systems shown besides the character creator. But what little is shown doesn't look bad and looks more real than other fan projects I've seen before. Reportedly, the footage behind the scenes in the alpha was also much better. Unfortunately, it was recently put on a hiatus, with updates only being published to the Discord and no real drive to finish the project after many years now. I wouldn't wait with bated breath on this one, though you could still stop by the Discord and check it out. My worry is, anyway, if none of the foundational issues about the game are fixed, a new coat of paint and engine isn't really going to be enough to overcome those fatal issues. But the community, as typical with those legends I might add, wouldn't stop saving the day with a UE5 remake project, and would announce the launching of a rogue server November 2024. The server set to launch into open alpha in 2025 would feature fixed engine issues and modernization changes that were designed to help bring the game to a modern 2025. It would also strip the cash shop functions that were added to the game later on by Nexion Technologies. While this might seem alienating to people that were more like classic players of the game, Empire Rising, as it was being dubbed, seemingly was conscious of this and would also announce the intentions to introduce a classic single-player version that would promise 21 different worlds to explore. Personally, I think that this is the best outcome for Face of Mankind. It's kind of like the Phantasy Star approach, and I think that the game could have had far more longevity with an angle like this instead. That's because, and now we've come full circle, a sci-fi MMORPG is not easy to make, especially a sci-fi MMO ARPG. That's why the most successful ones are ancient or made by the biggest and best designers. These are the most ambitious kind of virtual worlds to craft, especially the player-run ones. Think of how long Star Citizen has been cooking in the pot. Face of Mankind, though, was not Star Citizen. It was doomed from the start, really. It never had a realistic content plan that could keep players coming back and keep making the company money. It also launched, sandwiched in between some major hit sci-fi virtual worlds that overshadowed it greatly. FOM was always an underdog, coming from a lesser-known place regarding virtual worlds in Europe, Germany, even though it boasted impressive systems and gameplay experiences that were pretty much unforgettable for some players, but never quite looked at as a serious game due to the subpar gameplay and how off-putting the social systems could be. And in some ways, I could relate, as, I was a Darkfall Online player. Now, Darkfall Online had amazing gameplay. It's a bit different there, but with Darkfall Online, you had a whole RPG component of the game, and that actually managed to attract a lot of casual players to the game. A whole massive world and economy, and monsters for you to slay. The issue with Darkfall being is that it couldn't keep those players due to poor systems, and a slew of other issues that I would cover in that Death of a Game episode. But they still managed to sell like 100k plus copies in, no time, and as an indie developer, that's super impressive. FOM, on the other hand, likely wasn't even close to attracting that amount of players, or attracting casual players, or just non-PvP gamers, because what would attract them to the game? It attracted hardcore PvPers and role players, but these players aren't always known for being the most friendly to newcomers, though exceptions exist with like D&D players. And even if it did, how could it keep those players when the game was so reliant on people just being good-natured in a virtual world video game where they could choose another identity, any kind of identity that they wanted? It really was too much to ask for in reality, though the idea would sound nice in practice. The music is playing detectives, which means we have reached the end of this timeline, and have gathered enough clues to solve this case. And so, for those who missed the clues along the way, why did Face of Mankind die? It had a flawed foundational design. It was mishandled and mismanaged. It had a lack of resources. It had a lack of casual player pipeline. Post and Ghost sequel. The vision that was required for the game needed more money and more players. The final point we covered right before our final deduction, but it's not a throwaway point. Can a fully player-run game succeed? Of course, the scale most likely though has to be shrunk if you want it to be fully player-run. There's a reason that Star Citizen is going for more of a simulation approach, where the NPCs in the world itself also has functions and rules that are enforced. But I think Marco was right about his idea, because the survival genre is kind of an example of it, and it's chock full of games that are almost only player-run, and some lacking PvE almost altogether. Players running around this world makes the gameplay every wipe for a survival game almost always unique and different, with different emerging gameplay scenarios being sprung from the cupboards of players' houses. I think the genius behind Face of Mankind is there. Sure, it never really had the widespread success it likely wanted, or isn't gonna get the credit it probably deserves, since the systems largely fell on their face and it had quite the bad public reception, but the central ideas behind the game, the idea that the player could drive the world and its interactions in a way that NPCs or the computer just couldn't rival due to the emerging gameplay and experiences possible with players, and, well, they were right. And it's been largely true in other gaming genres, like the survival game genre. And we likely have virtual world games like Face of Mankind to thank for that. Thanks for watching, and let me know in the comments below if you did or didn't play Face of Mankind and why, and if you think a virtual world, massive or not, fully player driven, could work. Until the next case.